Welcome to the second episode in a series where I'm doing a total rebuild on my cheap CNC. In this episode, I will be modifying the original frame. That means I'll be expanding the size, adding some strength, and I've got to open a whole lot of new holes for the new arrangement that I've come up with. So anyway, let's get into it. So throughout this project, I'm actually using quite a lot of jigs that I've 3D printed. In this case, this one's so big it actually has to be printed diagonally to fit on the bed of my Artillery X1. Most of the jigs have a common feature of having these little dimples that will actually allow me to locate it into the original frame. And for this upright here, I'm actually just drilling 2 new holes. For the front and rear panels, however, I have to open quite a lot of holes, both for mounting those linear bearing rods as well as the new corner brackets that I've added to the system as well. Yeah, I think it looks pretty good. So I'm gluing on these 3D printed frame extensions with just super glue. I was going to pin them, but in the end I deemed it not necessary, so copious amounts of super glue is simply applied and sticking it on there like this. For the front and rear panels, as I showed in the prior episode, these pieces I couldn't print on my 3D printer. I probably could maybe if I printed it diagonally, but anyway, at the time I deemed I couldn't print it in one piece, so I've actually printed it in 2 pieces and I'm gluing those together. I'm using that 2040 rail there to provide a straight edge support to make sure that everything sort of comes together straight when it sets up. For the 2mm aluminium plates, I've just covered them all in masking tape, and then before I actually cut them out, I'm actually marking the areas and the layout. It's a pretty tight fit, so as you can see, the 2 side frames actually have to have on this weird angle to get them to fit in there, but thankfully I could get it all in one sheet. Just like that. So I'm hand sanding here a little bit just to sort of flatten things out a little bit where things are not quite coming together quite level. There's a lot of sort of excess super glue also popping through there as well, so a little bit of treatment there. You can see I've also inserted in some of those holes that I'm using 3D printed plugs to fill it out. Yeah, I think the result looks pretty good. Even where that joint is there, everything sort of meshes together nicely. I couldn't really come up with a better way to sort of chop up all of the pieces out of the aluminium sheet, so yeah, this is what I'm doing. A reciprocal saw and a metal blade. But it cuts pretty quickly, I reckon, and you know, there's not too much kerf, so you don't get much waste. So yeah, I think this is as good anyway as any, but you really need to make sure you support the material on each side. I mean, the last thing you want to do is bend it. Yeah, the time lapse makes it look pretty easy, but actually takes a bit more time than this. So yeah, I think I'd call that a success. There's all the pieces pre-cut roughly anyway. So I'm marking out on the aluminium sheets where I'm going to place some pins, some locating pins for when I do the gluing so things don't slide around. So these are the pins that I've 3D printed in PLA. You can see they fit in these existing holes quite well. They're a little bit large, these original holes. And these 5mm holes that I've drilled here are a little bit too small, so I'm going to have to file that down a bit. And just running the drill and forcing it in there also is a good way to get it to fit quite nicely. So without using these pins and then trying to epoxy, I know from experience that this is just going to hydroplane everywhere. So this is really a good way to make sure things stay in place while things are setting up. Just like that. Yeah, it looks good. And before I get into gluing, I'm just going to rough up the surface a little bit with this 60 grain sanding paper and an orbital sander. Just a light sand. I don't want to go in there too deep. And of course the aluminium surface as well needs to get a bit of a hit. This stuff really burns up pretty quickly, so I don't want to get too aggressive with that. Yeah, I think that's going to give a really good keying into the epoxy there, so it's going to work nicely. And just before I get to epoxying, I will use a bit of alcohol here just to make sure I get all the dust and grime out of the surface, any oils and stuff off the surface. I want to make sure we get the best possible adhesion. And now for the big show, yeah, epoxy and tons of it. It's a little bit stressful when you're doing this stuff. You've got a limited amount of time to work, so you've got to move quickly. Obviously the time lapse makes it look like I'm moving a lot more quickly than I really am, but you get the point. So here we go. And I'm just using a wide, thin plastic spatula there to really spread it out evenly all around. Put those pins in there. And I'll also knock them in there to make sure that they don't come out while I'm messing around. And we're also going to coat the surface of the original frame as well. And finally, I'm just using a bit of MDF and a few other sheets of material I have around to use clamps to try to get some good even pressure applied all the way around. And I'm using a big kerosene stove as well. You can see I've also added a bit more weight there by throwing my drill on there as well. Alright, so it's time to see how we've done. paper's so obviously going to be stuck on everything there. Not much I can do about that. Oh. Stuck on there real tight. Look at that, it's even stuck to the MDF a bit. These two are so close together I can't even break them apart. Good. Do that off camera. Alrighty. So that's everything glued up there, it's looking good. And I've also decided to add a little bit more aluminium plating on the front and rear panels as well, just to strengthen up that center section a little bit, around about here. And for the stepper motor side, I'm going to use a bigger piece which covers the surface of the stepper motor, and that's going to go here like that. Actually, I've already cut out the plates. These are the two plates that I'm going to glue on there a little bit later on. So I reckon this is probably the most fun part. I'm using my router to cut off all that excess. Obviously, if I didn't have a router, I could have filed it off or sanded it off with my belt sander or something, but I think this is a much more satisfying way to do it. It's definitely a lot easier. It does, however, generate a huge amount of those very, very fine chips. They're not sharp, right? You don't like cut yourself on them, but they do. They're so fine that they actually float in the air. I mean, I've got my vacuum cleaner going there, but it's not doing anything. And yeah, this stuff just seems to get everywhere. I've been trying to get it out of my house for weeks now. But anyway, it's a small sacrifice to pay for what, as you will see, is a pretty good way of doing this actually. Now I've got this hole for the stepper motor which I've got to open up as well, so step drill just to sort of get enough space to get over the bit, and then just doing the same thing again with the router, and it's really a perfect result every time. Looking good. So now I actually have to open up all of those holes in the aluminium plate side. So I'm just using those original holes that we pre-drilled earlier with the jig and just pushing through and opening up all those holes. For the left and right side, I'm actually doing an extra step where I'm using the other half as a jig to drill those holes to make sure that everything sort of aligns as perfectly as possible. It's really not that critical, these holes, but I don't know. It makes me feel good to try and get it right anyway. And these are the holes for the stepping motor. Yeah, looking pretty good. So far, so good. So here we go, another round of epoxy for those smaller panels that I'm putting on the front side. This is a much easier job, so it doesn't take very long. I'm also taking the opportunity to fill in some of those unwanted holes using epoxy because, well, why not? Could be anything. I could use 3D printed plugs that I've been plugging up the other holes with, but epoxy is as good as anything, so that's what I'm going to use here. I'm only using one locating pin, which I sort of regret because it did actually rotate around a little bit. So reminded yourself, always use 2 pins when you're using locating pins. Yeah, it's a bit of a mistake, but anyway, nothing that I couldn't recover from. Just clean up those edges. And here you can see where I've cut the slot in the bed to allow space for those little plate on the stepper motor side, because there's obviously not enough space. So yeah, it's a small sacrifice, but I think it's okay. So on the front panel, I also opened up the center hole to match the 8mm size of the lead screw. And on the rear side, I also have opened up the hole on that aluminium plate to fit a bearing housing, which I'll add later. And I also added 4 through bolts on the front panel as well, just to tie together the front and rear aluminium plates. I mean, the epoxy should be enough, but this is just to make me feel good. For the rear panel, however, we have the bolts that mount the stepper motor, so that's actually going to tie the front and rear panels together in any case. And you can see that I'm actually countersinking the bolts here for those as well. Didn't actually need to countersink, I'm not sure why I did, but anyway. And then I actually have to open up the hole, that center hole, to be large enough to mount the stepper motor on there. Now I made a bit of a dog's breakfast of this. I actually had that stepping drill wander quite a lot off center, and yeah, it's quite annoying. So I had to open up the hole a little bit larger than I would have liked to, but yeah, it's not too bad anyway. It's a little bit annoying. More of a hit to the pride than anything else, I guess. Anyway, next time I'll be more careful with my stepper drill. And there you have it. I think it looks pretty good, even with my bit of a mistake I made. That's because most of the mistakes on the other side where you can't see it. But anyway, yeah, just believe me, it looks good, right? That's good enough. And here is the X-axis stepper motor mounted onto the upright here. You can see I've countersunk those bolts so that they don't protrude and bump into the Z-axis assembly. And now we're finally into the home stretch of finishing off these frame panels. I'm using just a normal marker here to sort of first coat the PLA, and I do that because the marker pen seems to soak into that PLA a little bit better than the paint pen, which you'll see me use here in a minute. The paint pen sort of seems to sit a little bit more on the surface. So this is the paint pen I'm using. I think I've shown it in a prior episode somewhere along the line. And the finish of this paint pen is really quite nice. It matches very well the original material of the frame when it dries up. But it is susceptible to scratching if you sort of scratch it or whatever, it comes off, which is why I use the marker pen underneath, because my idea is that if you get a little scratch on it, then that marker pen will show its face on the underside, so you won't really notice it. It'll still look black. And to be honest, I was really quite surprised and very happy with the finish that I got out of this marker pen, out of this paint pen, sorry. You can see it really sets up and looks very much like that original finish of the material that was on the CNC3018. Yeah, it looks really nice. So for the aluminium side of things, I can finally remove the protective masking tape, and it did a pretty good job at all overall of protecting it. But I'm not really loving this finish. So yeah, I decided to sand it a bit, sort of get a brushed aluminium type finish. Well, the best I can get at doing that manually anyway. And there you have what the front and the rear panels going to look the same anyway, but you get the idea. And I'll just show you finishing up one of the side panels, because obviously again it's the same thing all the way around. There are actually a few dings and scratches on some of these panels, even though I masked them up a bit. So I think that's a good thing that I actually am sort of brush finishing it anyway. I think the brush finish is going to be a lot more manageable over time. Anyway, we'll see. I will tell you one thing, however, it was quite a slog sanding all of this aluminium surface. Went through quite a few sheets of sandpaper, that's for sure. But overall, I think it was all well worth the effort, and yeah, it looked pretty good. So I reckon that's about enough for this episode. In the next episode, I'll be focusing on the linear rod bearings, the ones that go under the bed, and how to mount them with hopefully with some degree of precision. I'm sure some of you out there will be pleased, however, to know that, we'll actually be getting out the old mini lathe and doing a bit of work. Actually, the next couple of episodes will be probably pretty intensively focused on mini lathe work. So for those who are interested in that sort of stuff, it's probably definitely worth trying to catch those episodes, that's for sure. Anyway, that's it. That'll do. Do hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in the next one. So, yeah, I'll see you then.